The Negev Bedouin are traditionally pastoral nomadic Arab tribes living in the Negev region in Israel. From 1858, during Ottoman rule, the Negev Bedouin underwent a process of sedentarization which accelerated after the founding of Israel. In the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, most resettled in neighbouring regions. Between 1968 and 1989, Israel built 7 townships in the northeast of the Negev for the Bedouin population, with about half of them relocating to these areas. Others remained in unrecognized villages built without planning which lacked basic services such as electricity and running water. The Israeli government has gradually recognized some of them and taken measures to improve infrastructure and basic services, while the majority are slated for destruction with the population facing forced displacement. The pastoral plan was drawn up to address land ownership claims and compensation. The plan also called for the evacuation of 35 unrecognized villages and the resettlement of residents in existing and new towns. According to human rights organizations opposed to the plan, it discriminated against the Bedouin population of the Negev and violated the community's historic land rights. In December 2013, the plan was rescinded. The Bedouin population in the Negev numbers 200,000–210,000. Just over half of them live in 7 government-built Bedouin-only towns. The remaining 90,000 live in 46 villages, 35 of which are unrecognized and 11 of which were officially recognized 10 years ago. The rate of growth of the Negev Bedouin is the highest in the world. The Bedouin population doubles its size every 15 years. Characteristics: Negev Bedouin used to be nomadic and later also semi-nomadic Arabs who live by rearing livestock in the deserts of southern Israel. The community is traditional and conservative, with a well-defined value system that directs and monitors behavior and interpersonal relations. The Negev Bedouin tribes have been divided into 3 classes, according to their origin: descendants of ancient Arabian nomads, descendants of Sinai Bedouin tribes, and Palestinian peasants who came from cultivated areas. Alt-Arabin tribe is the largest tribe in the Negev and the Sinai Peninsula. Alt-Arabin along with Alt-Yaha and Al-Azazma are the largest tribes in the Negev. Counter to the image of the Bedouin as fierce stateless nomads roving the entire region, by the turn of the 20th century, much of the Bedouin population in Palestine was settled, semi-nomadic, and engaged in agriculture according to an intricate system of land ownership, grazing rights, and water access. Today, many Bedouin call themselves Negev Arabs rather than Bedouin, explaining that Bedouin identity is intimately tied in with the pastoral nomadic way of life. A way of life, they say, is over. Although the Bedouin in Israel continue to be perceived as nomads, today all of them are fully sedentarized, and about half are urbanites. Nevertheless, Negev Bedouin continue to possess sheep and goats. In 2000, the Ministry of Agriculture estimated that the Negev Bedouin own 200,000 head of sheep and 5,000 of goats, while Bedouin estimates referred to 230,000 sheep and 20,000 goats. History. Antiquity. Historically, the Bedouin engaged in nomadic herding, agriculture, and sometimes fishing. They also earned income by transporting goods and people across the desert. Scarcity of water and of permanent pastoral land required them to move constantly. The first recorded nomadic settlement in Sinai dates back 4,000–7,000 years. The Bedouin of the Sinai Peninsula migrated to and from the Negev. The Bedouin established very few permanent settlements. However, some evidence remains of traditional biker buildings, seasonal dwellings for the rainy season when they would stop to engage in farming. Cemeteries known as nuamis, dating to the late 4th millennium BC, have been also found. Similarly, open-air mosques dating from the early Islamic period are common and still in use. The Bedouin conducted extensive farming on plots scattered throughout the Negev. During the 6th century, Emperor Justinian sent Wallachian and Bosnian slaves to the Sinai to build St. Catherine's Monastery. Over time, these slaves converted to Islam and adopted an Arab Bedouin lifestyle. Islamic era. In the 7th century, the Islamic Umayyad dynasty defeated the Byzantine armies conquering Palestine. The Umayyads began sponsoring building programs throughout Palestine, a region in close proximity to the dynastic capital in Damascus, and the Bedouin flourished. However, this activity decreased after the capital was moved to Baghdad during the subsequent Abbasid reign. Ottoman era. Most of the Negev Bedouin tribes migrated to the Negev from the Arabian Desert, Transjordan, Egypt, and the Sinai from the 18th century onwards. Traditional Bedouin lifestyle began to change after the French invasion of Egypt in 1798. The rise of the puritanical Wahhabi sect forced them to reduce the raiding of caravans. Instead, the Bedouin acquired a monopoly on guiding pilgrim caravans to Mecca, as well as selling them provisions. The opening of the Suez Canal reduced the dependence on desert caravans and attracted the Bedouin to newly formed settlements that sprung up along the canal. Bedouin sedentarization began under Ottoman rule following the need in establishing law and order in the Negev. The Ottoman Empire viewed the Bedouins as a threat to the state's control. In 1858, a new Ottoman land law was issued that offered the legal grounds for the displacement of the Bedouin. Under the Tanzimat reforms instituted as the Ottoman Empire gradually lost power, the Ottoman land law of 1858 instituted an unprecedented land registration process which was also meant to boost the empire's tax base. Few Bedouin opted to register the lands with the Ottoman Tarp due to lack of enforcement by the Ottomans, illiteracy, refusal to pay taxes and lack of relevance of written documentation of ownership to the Bedouin way of life at the time. At the end of the 19th century, Sultan Abdul Hamid II undertook other measures in order to control the Bedouin. As a part of this policy, he settled loyal Muslim populations from the Balkan and Caucasus among the areas predominantly populated by the nomads, and also created several permanent Bedouin settlements, although the majority of them did not remain. In 1900, an urban administrative center of Beersheba was established in order to extend governmental control over the area. Another measure initiated by the Ottoman authorities was the private acquisition of large plots of state land offered by the Sultan to the absentee landowners. Numerous tenants were brought in order to cultivate the newly acquired lands, and the main trend of settling non-Bedouin population in the Palestine remained until the last days of the empire. By the 20th century, much of the Bedouin population was settled, semi-nomadic, and engaged in agriculture according to an intricate system of land ownership, grazing rights, and water access. During World War I, the Negev Bedouin fought with the Turks against the British, but later withdrew from the conflict. Ahmad Pasha al-Sufi, sheikh of the Naimat subtribe of the Tarabin, led a force of 1,500 men which joined the Turkish offensive against the Suez Canal. The main tribes of the Negev, al-Tarabin, al-Tayaha, al-Azazma, united and formed force of 1,500 armed Bedouins under the leadership of Sheikh Ahmad Bashir al-Sufi. They moved to Sinai, and on the 15th of November 1914, they attacked 2 battalions of the British Army. Soldiers of the 1st Battalion Battalion were entirely killed. The 2nd Battalion were captured. During the Sheikh al-Sufi presence in Sinai, al-Sawaki tribe occupied region Karara in Khan Yunis and they expelled its inhabitants from al-Hanaja tribe and al-Tarabin. Sheikh al-Sufi led al-Tarabin tribe to fight al-Sawaki tribe in Khan Yunis. They fought them, sieged them. Al-Sawaka asked truce and safety from al-Tarabin tribe and Sheikh al-Sufi ordered them to leave all into the Sinai. British Mandate era. The British Mandate in Palestine brought order to the Negev. However, this order was accompanied by losses in sources of income and poverty among the Bedouin. The Bedouin nevertheless retained the lifestyle, and a 1927 report describes them as the untamed denizens of the Arabian deserts. The British also established the first formal schools for the Bedouin. In Orientalist historiography, the Negev Bedouin have been described as remaining largely unaffected by changes in the outside world until recently. The society was often considered a world without time. Recent scholars have challenged the notion of the Bedouin as fossilized or stagnant reflections of an unchanging desert culture. Emmanuel Marx has shown that Bedouin were engaged in a constantly dynamic reciprocal relation with urban centers. Bedouin scholar Michael Meeker explains that the city was to be found in the midst. The British Mandate authorities, laws and bureaucracy favored settled groups above pastoral nomads, and they found it hard to fit in the Negev Bedouin into the system of governance. Thus the Mandate's policy regarding the Bedouin tribes of Palestine was often of an ad hoc nature. But eventually, as had happened with the Ottoman authorities, the British turned to coercion. Several regulations were issued, such as the Bedouin Control Ordinance, meant to provide the administration with special powers of control of nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes with the object of persuading them towards a more settled way of life. The ample powers of the ordinance empowered the district commissioner to direct the Bedouin to go to or not go to, or to remain in any specified area. Mandatory land policies created legal and demographic pressures for sedentarization, and by the end of the British Mandate the majority of the Bedouin were settled. They built some 60 new villages and dispersed settlements, populated by 27,500 people in 1945, according to the Mandate authorities. The only exception were the Negev Bedouin, who remained semi-nomadic, but it was clear that sooner or later they will be settled too. 1948 war. Prior to the founding of Israel, the Negev's population consisted almost entirely of 110,000 Bedouin. During the war, most Negev Bedouin favored the Arab side of the conflict and thus fled or were expelled to Jordan, Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank. In March 1948, Bedouin and semi-Bedouin communities began to leave the homes and encampments in response to Palmach retaliation raids following attacks on water pipelines to Jewish cities. On 16 August 1948, the Negev Brigade launched a full-scale clearing operation in the Kawfaka al-Muharraka area, displacing villages and Bedouin for military reasons. At the end of September, the Yiftach Brigade launched an operation west of Mishmahan Negev, expelling Arabs and confiscating the livestock. In early 1949, the Israeli army moved thousands of Bedouin from south and west of Beersheba to a concentration zone east of the town. In November 1949, 500 families were expelled across the border into Jordan, and on September 2, 1950, some 4,000 Bedouin were forced to cross the border with Egypt. Only around 11,000 of the 110,000 Bedouin population remained in the Negev. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Naim Sarig, the Palmach commander in the Negev, instructed his officers that Our job is to appear before the Arabs as a ruling force which functions forcefully but with justice and fairness, with the provisions that they avoid harming women, children and friendly Arabs. The orders stated that shepherds grazing on Jewish land should be driven off by gunfire, that searches of Arab settlements be conducted politely but firmly, and you are permitted to execute any man found in possession of a weapon. Of the approximately 110,000 Bedouin who lived in the area before the war, about 11,000 remain. Most had relocated from the northwestern to the northeastern Negev. Bedouin refugees in Jordan, due to destabilizing tribal wars from 1780 to 1890, many Negev Bedouins tribes forced to move to southern Jordan, Sinai Peninsula. After the tribal war of 1890, tribal land boundaries remained fixed until the 1948 war, by which time the Bedouin of the Negev numbered approximately 110,000, and were organized into 95 tribes and clans. When Beersheba was occupied by the Israeli army in 1948, 90% of the Bedouin population of the Negev were deported, mainly to Jordan and Gaza. Of the approximately 110,000 Bedouin who lived in the Negev before the war, about 11,000 remain. Israel. The first Israeli government, headed by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, opposed the return of the Bedouin from Jordan and Egypt. At first he wanted to expel a few remaining Bedouin but changed his mind. The lands were nationalized and the area was declared a military zone. The government saw the Negev as a potential home for the masses of Jewish immigrants, including 700,000 Jewish refugees from Arab lands. In the following years, some 50 Jewish settlements were established in the Negev. The Bedouin who remained in the Negev belonged to the Tiaha Confederation, as well as some smaller groups such as the Azazmi and the Javelin. They were relocated by the Israeli government in the 1950s and 1960s to a restricted zone in the northeast corner of the Negev, called the Sire, made up of 10% of the Negev desert in the northeast. In 1951, the United Nations reported the deportation of about 7,000 Negev Bedouin to Jordan, the Gaza Strip and Sinai, but many returned undetected. The new government failed to issue to the Bedouin identity cards until 1952 and deported thousands of Bedouin who remained within the new borders. Deportation continued into the late 1950s. As reported by Haaretz newspaper in 1959, the Army's desert patrols would turn up in the midst of a Bedouin encampment day after day, dispersing it with a sudden burst of machine gun fire until the sons of the desert were broken and, gathering what little was left of the belongings, led the camels in long silent strings into the heart of the Sinai desert. Land ownership issues. Israel's land policy was adapted to a large extent from the Ottoman land regulations of 1858. According to the 1858 Ottoman land law, lands that were not registered as of private ownership were considered state lands, but Bedouins were not motivated to register lands they lived on, because land ownership meant additional responsibilities for them, including taxation and military duty, and it created a new problem since they found it hard to prove their ownership rights. Israel relied mainly on taboo recordings. Most of the Bedouin land fell under the Ottoman class of non-workable land and thus belonged to the state under Ottoman law. Israel nationalized most of the Negev lands, using the Land Rights Settlement Ordinance from 1969. Israel's policies regarding the Negev Bedouin at first included regulation and relocation. During the 1950s, Israel has relocated two-thirds of the Negev Bedouins into an area that was under a martial law. Bedouin tribes were concentrated in the Sa'ar Triangle of Beersheba, Arad and Dimona. At the same time, Bedouin herding was restricted by land expropriation. The Black Goat Law of 1950 curbed grazing so as to prevent land erosion, prohibiting the grazing of goats outside recognized landholdings. Because few Bedouin territorial claims were recognized, most grazing was rendered illegal. Since both Ottoman and British land registration processes had failed to reach into the Negev region before Israeli rule, and since most Bedouin preferred not to register the lands, few Bedouin possessed any documentation of the land claims. Those whose land claims were recognized found it almost impossible to keep the goats within the periphery of the newly limited range. Into the 1970s and 1980s, only a small portion of the Bedouin were able to continue to graze the goats, and instead of migrating with their goats in search of pasture, most Bedouin migrated in search of work. Despite state hegemony over the Negev, the Bedouin regarded 600,000 dunams of the Negev as theirs, and later petitioned the government for the return. Various claims committees were established to make legal arrangements to solve land disputes at least partially, but no proposals acceptable to both sides were approved. In the 1950s, as a consequence of losing access to their lands, many Bedouin men sought work on Jewish farms in the Negev. However, preference was given to Jewish labor, and as of 1958, employment in the Bedouin male population was less than 3.5%. IDF chief Moshe Dayan was in favor of transfer the Bedouin to the center of the country in order to eliminate land claims and create a cadre of urban laborers. In 1963, he told Haaretz, "We should transform the Bedouin into an urban proletariat in industry, services, construction, and agriculture." 88% of the Israeli population are not farmers. Let the Bedouin be like them. Indeed, this will be a radical move, which means that the Bedouin would not live on his land with his herds, but would become an urban person who comes home in the afternoon and puts his slippers on. His children will get used to a father who wears pants without a dagger and who does not pick out the nits in public. They will go to school, the hair combed and parted. This will be a revolution, but it can be achieved in 2 generations, without coercion but with governmental direction. This phenomenon of the Bedouins will disappear. Ben-Gurion supported this idea, but the Bedouins strongly opposed. Later, the proposal was withdrawn. IDF commander Yigal Allon proposed to concentrate the Bedouin in some large townships within the Sayag. This proposal resembled an earlier IDF plan, which intended to secure land suitable for settling Jews and setting up IDF bases, as well as to remove the Bedouin from key Negev routes. Israeli-built townships. Between 1968 and 1989, the state established urban townships for housing of deported Bedouin tribes and promised Bedouin services in exchange for the renunciation of their ancestral land. Within a few years, half of the Bedouin population moved into the 7 townships built for them by the Israeli government. The largest Bedouin locality in Israel is the city of Rehat, established in 1971. Other towns include Tel Az-Sabi, Shakib al-Salam in 1979, Awa Arar and Nakab and Kusaifa in 1982, Lakia in 1985 and Hura in 1989. Those who moved into these townships were mainly the Bedouin with no land claims. According to Ben-Gurion University's Negev Center for Regional Development, the towns were built without an urban policy framework, business districts or industrial zones, as Harvey Lythak of the Negev Center for Regional Development explains. The major failure was a lack of an economic rationale for the towns. According to Lythik and Ismail and Kathleen Abu Saad of Ben-Gurion University, the towns quickly became among the most deprived towns in Israel, severely lacking in services such as public transport and banks. The urban townships were plagued by endemic joblessness and resulting cycles of crime and drug trafficking. The Bedouin of Tarabin clan have moved into a township built for them, Tarabin al-Sana. The Bedouin of al-Azazmi clan will take part in the planning of a new quarter that will be erected for them to west of Negev Shalom township, cooperating with the authority for the regulation of Bedouin settlement in the Negev. According to a state controller report from 2002, the Bedouin townships were built with minimal investment, and infrastructure in the 7 townships had not improved much in the span of 3 decades. In 2002, most homes were not connected to the sewage system, the water supply was erratic and the roads were not adequate. Lessons were learned and new policies have been implemented since then, with the Israeli government allocating special funds to improve the well-being of the Negev Bedouin. In 2008, a railway station opened near the largest Bedouin town in the Negev, Rehat, improving the transportation situation. Since 2009, Galim buses have been operating in Rehat. On the 16th of September 2014, it was announced that 12,500 Bedouins would be moved to a new area in the Jordan Valley north of Jericho in prefab homes put up by Israel. Unrecognized villages. See article. Unrecognized Bedouin villages in Israel. Those Bedouin who resisted sedentarization and urban life remained in the villages. In 2007, 39 to 45 villages were not recognized by the state and were thus ineligible for municipal services such as connection to the electrical grid, water mains or trash pickup. According to a 2007 report of the Israel Land Authority, 40% of the population were living in unrecognized villages. Many insist on remaining in unrecognized villages in the hope of retaining the traditions and customs. These are rural villages, some of which predate Israel. However, in 1984, the courts ruled that the Negev Bedouin had no land ownership claims, effectively illegalizing their existing settlements. The Israeli government defines these rural Bedouin villages as dispersals, while the international community refers to them as unrecognized villages. Few of the Bedouin in unrecognized villages have seen the urban townships as a desirable form of settlement. Extreme unemployment has afflicted unrecognized villages as well, breeding extreme crime levels. Sources of income such as grazing have been severely restricted and the Bedouin rarely receive permits to engage in self-subsistence agriculture. Although the ELA has leased on a yearly basis JNF-owned land in Basor Valley to Bedouin, today, several unrecognized villages are in the process of recognition. They have been incorporated into the Abu Basmar Regional Council created for the purpose of dealing with specific problems of the Bedouin. So far they remain without water, electricity and garbage services, although there is a certain improvement. For example, in Al-Said 2 new schools were built and a medical clinic has been opened since its recognition in 2004. Development has been hampered by urban planning difficulties and land ownership problems. Due to the lack of municipal waste services and trash pickup, backyard burning has been adopted on a large scale, impacting badly on public health and the environment. Negev Bedouin claim the ownership of land totaling some 600,000 dunams. It is 12 times the size of Tel Aviv. When land ownership claims claims reach the court. Few Bedouin can supply enough evidence to prove ownership, since landlots they claim have never been registered in the taboo, which is the only official way to register them. For example, in the Al-Arakib land ownership dispute, Judge Sarah Dovrat has ruled in favor of the state, saying that the land was not assigned to the plaintiffs, nor held by them under conditions required by law, and that they still had to prove the rights to the land by proof of its registration in the taboo. On September 29, 2003, the government adopted the new Abu Basma plan, calling for a new regional council to unify unrecognized Bedouin settlements, the Abu Basma Regional Council. This resolution provided for the establishment of 7 Bedouin townships in the Negev, and recognizing previously unrecognized villages, which would be granted municipal status and consequently all basic services and infrastructure. The council was established by the Interior Ministry on 28 January 2004. In 2012, 13 Bedouin towns and cities were being built or expanded. Several new industrial zones are planned, such as Aden Negev on the suburbs of Rahat. It will have a hospital and a new campus inside.